Okay, one of the most important and most complex pieces of tools that you might use inside of Maya will be the graph editor. I can spend hours and many lectures explaining the graph editor, and I'm going to do my best to try to explain to you in the simplest forms of how this graph editor works. And through each exercise, I'm going to be diving deeper and deeper into using the graph editor and what it does and how to make it work for your animations, what to look out for, best practices, and how to really start understanding what is happening inside of this very complex interface. We're going to start with the absolute basics. If you take a look at the left, it's an example of a graph editor curve. You have two keys. The keys that I'm speaking of roughly show the indicators where you see the black dots. And what we're basically seeing is two keyframes, basically a ball that starts on the left side of the screen and then moves to the right side of the screen. If you look at the tangents, they're very flat. If you see the ends of the basically these handles, they're kind of like Bezier curves that you might see in Illustrator or Photoshop. So they're kind of similar in that sense. If they're flat and you can kind of see how those curves start to kind of rotate in a non-linear fashion. They have kind of a little bit of a curve to them, and then they kind of straighten out in the middle. What's essentially happening there is it's allowing this ball to move slow at the beginning, speed up in the middle, and then it slows down at the end. So the curves essentially always reflect how the movement is going to take place when you see it inside of Maya. So depending on how your curves are shaped and depending on how your tangents are looking, that's directly going to impact how your animation looks inside as it starts to move. One other thing that's really important to start to learn that can take lots of experimentation and visual understanding is spacing. And when I refer to spacing, if you take a look at the image on the right, you can see that these red dots are in different spaces on the axis inside of Maya here. Now, if you take a look at the keys that are represented, or actually the spacing is indicated by these red dots, you can see that they are closer together at the beginning and closer together at the end, and then more spread apart in the middle. The more spread apart they are, the faster the object is moving. And that is indicated in the graph editor tangent by looking at the middle of that curve where it's basically in a diagonal line, pretty much a complete diagonal arc, or a diagonal line altogether. So like a 45-degree angle for the most part. And how that's being reflected in terms of spacing is due to that curve and how it's looking, you're going to have that speed up happening in the middle of the image on the right with the ball moving. So it's gonna start to make a little bit more sense as you take a look at how these curves can be adjusted and how it affects this simple ball movement with utilizing either the same amount of keys or more keys. One thing that you do want to keep in mind when you do start posing and animating your characters or your objects is varying up the timing. And when I refer to spacing again, I'm referring to those red dots on the timeline, varying up your spacing. So if you look at this example, it's pretty much exactly the same at the beginning and the end. And it's very even, it's very flat. Spacing is very, you would call this even spacing, where basically the beginning and the end of the animation are identical. And then the middle kind of has its little bit of interest there, but for the most part, it's essentially kind of the exact same mirrored movement. And so we want to try to avoid that. We want to try to break things up when movements in real life happen. Nothing moves at the same speed. We don't want to have robotic movements, and that's what we're going to be learning in this course. And that all applies to how your graph editor work tends to look like. So in our second slide here, what we're going to be taking a look at is varying up some of the curves and essentially cleaning up some of the movements that are happening in this animation. So by just adjusting the curves slightly in this example, you can start to see that some of the timing is not as even. You still have a slow movement at the beginning and then a slow ease out at the end of the animation, but it's starting to have a little bit more weight. You can see the spacing is still very even if you take a look at the spacing in the middle and the left and the right of the ball. But it gives you an indicator to see when you start setting those extra keys. Now you've got basically 4 keys on this particular example, these ease in and ease out keys. What that's allowing it to do is to kind of vary up that timing so that it's not just animation done by the computer. You're actually kind of manipulating and adjusting that timing. And what you might be able to do is adjust that that spacing that's taking place. So you could essentially have the beginning of the animation not be as slow as the end of the animation. In this particular case, it's pretty much even, but by adjusting those ease out keys and those tangents that you have in your graph editor, you can start to vary up the timing and start to get some more interesting movement. Going a little bit further into the graph editor, if we vary up that spacing at the beginning of the animation, now we can take a look at the red dots in the animation, and the spacing is becoming a lot more interesting and a lot less symmetrical. So by adjusting the curves in the graph editor on the left side, you can see that the tangent handle has now become more of a 45-degree angle. And what that's done is it's created a different type of spacing than is happening at the end of the curve. And what that indicates here with our red dots is showing that the animation is going to be faster at the beginning and slowing up at the end. So it's starting to have a lot more weight. It's starting to feel a little more interesting and less even, and you're having less symmetry in the movement. And this is the importance of the graph editor and understanding how these curves work and what just small changes in these curves can do to your animation to not only make it feel a little more lifelike, but to also vary up your spacing so that the animation looks a lot more interesting. Now, if we go a step further and add even more keys, what we can do is start to add some of these anticipations, overshoots, and settles that we learned about in the 12 principles of animation. Now, what we essentially have happening here is the ball is going backwards, anticipating, creating some extra momentum, and then it dives forward, creating this long curve that you see with that red dot in the middle, showing that the spacing is a lot faster in the middle. And then it'll hit this wall at the end, bounce back, overshoot, and then kind of settle back to its ending position. So if you take a look at the end of the curves with the overshoots and the settles, you can see that these curves go larger and then die down in smaller curves towards the end of the animation. And what you're seeing visually with that is that the ball is going to hit that wall, bounce back, and hit those red dots that you see on the screen right, and then you're going to see some fast movement as it bounces off that wall, and then it's going to hit the wall again and bounce back less. And you take a look at those red dots in there, and you can start to see how that spacing has varied up, and now you're starting to see a much more interesting set of movements with the ball movement, and starting to get more weight and interest. And you visually can start to see now with the red dots how to vary up your spacing and your timing to get a much different performance in your animation. So one thing about the graph editor is basically how your graph editor looks is going to be how your animation appears in movement. So on the left side, you can see a lot of these tangents are kind of messy, and the curves are kind of flattening out on both the X and the Y, the green and the red curves on the left example. And on the right example, they're not perfect, but they are a little bit smoother, mostly referring to the red curves that you see there. So as you visually start to look at your graph editor curves, you're always going to want to try to smooth out these tangents. And one quick way to do that is to select all the curves and going into that graph editor and pressing that A, which is the auto tangent button. And when you press that auto tangent button, when you select all of your curves, it'll kind of just estimate and guess and kind of smooth those curves into each other with just one click of a button. A lot of times that'll get you most of the way there and clean up a lot of those jitters and pops that you might be seeing. But for the most part, you're always going to want to be taking a look at those curves, and you might need to dive in there yourself and start to clean up some of those curves so that everything is as smooth as possible. And that typically happens towards the end of the animation in the polishing phase. This is a very complex method, and it's very tedious, and it takes some getting used to and understanding what these curves do and when you need to adjust the tangent or when you can leave it alone. And as we work through these exercises and we start posing and animating these characters, I'm going to be constantly having that graph editor open so you can see exactly what those curves look like when I set a pose and when you start to see the character in movement. So diving further into the graph editor, taking a look at this slide, it's just another visual example to show you kind of what to look for when you start cleaning up these curve tangents in your graph editor. So the image on the left has a really big overshoot on these on this X. It could be a translation or a rotation, and you're seeing this big loop. If you flatten out that tangent and make it flat like you see on the right, then you have a nice controlled animation where you're not going to get this unwanted overshoot, and this overshoot meaning like as we were watching that ball as it hit the wall on the right side and then bounced back. That's kind of the overshoot as it kind of overshot the pose going to the left side and then hitting the wall again and then bouncing not quite as much. That first bounce would be considered an overshoot because it's going a lot. It's basically overshooting all the other poses and kind of creating a bigger move than some of the other movements after. The reason why you don't want to have a loop like this happening here with this big overshoot is you're not really in control over what's happening with your character. If you want to create overshoots, you want to do that yourself by actually setting a pose, like the ball example previously that we were looking at when that ball was basically keyed going to screen left after it hit that wall. So as we start animating, I'm going to be talking about how to create these overshoots and these settles for you, and how to make sure that you're not just having it done by mistake or just randomly from Maya, and that you're in constant control over the posing and the movement of your character. And by being able to do this is directly going to be handled right there in the graph editor. So taking a look and understanding your curves and understanding what's happening and how that's going to affect your movement and which axis you're working on is going to really make a big difference on how much control you have over the animation and the character, and it's going to really make a big difference on how you interact with this interface. Now the last slide that I have here is going to be another last example of just simplifying your keys. A lot of times it's very simple and very easy to set multiple keys, especially if you have the auto key set on. You can basically be posing and maybe you even moved a pose and you didn't even realize it, and you can end up with a lot of keys that are unnecessary in your animation. And basically what ends up happening is if you have a lot of these keys set in place, it can start to create a lot of jitter and unwanted movement. So by simplifying your keys, you can essentially have the same curve, the same movement with less keys. It'll be smoother and less complex. So if you end up deleting a key and it doesn't really affect the pose, chances are you don't need that key and you should just delete it. You can basically kind of experiment. If you think you have too many keys, start experimenting with deleting certain ones and seeing if that animation pops, and if you can just go ahead and remove that key altogether and still have the same performance. If you're answering that question and your answer you're finding is yes, then chances are you don't need that key and you should remove it. It's going to be creating some unwanted jitter, and chances are you're going to have a really hard time trying to smooth that jitter out. And a lot of times you can just remove those keys and just take a look at your graph editor, and you'll be in a much better position with much smoother, more natural animation. So constantly checking your graph editor to make sure that your curves are looking smooth and that everything is blending nicely into each other, is also a good indicator of whether or not you're going to need those keys in place. So simplifying is always going to be the basically animator's preference of choice. Just always try to be aware when you are setting those keys, or if you're using AutoKey, on what keys are being set. It can be very easy to set too many keys, and a good practice that I've found is to just start deleting keys and taking a look at the motion. And if you find that you do need those keys, to place them and adjust them in the graph editor to make sure that they are as smooth as possible.